Hello all, and in honor of Father's Day this year, I wanted to discuss Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, which is of course famous for being really the defense of the divine right of kings and monarchy and the father as really the natural law of the sovereign. And of course, famously, John Locke and others would critique Robert Filmer for this and sustain that natural law is bestowed upon all men. And here today on Father's Day, I wanted to really look at Patriarcha itself, likely written sometime in the 30s, 1630s, although it wasn't actually published until 1680. So this is just a little bit of a backdrop before we really actually get going here. And so starting off, Filmer is going to historically trace back this patriarchal idea and its divinity going all the way back to Noah and his carving really of the world onto his sons. It's suggested that, of course, Noah scowled through the Mediterranean and bestowing each kingdom, Europe, Africa, and Asia, onto each of his sons, in which they made somewhat of an agreement, or in his wishes was to not betray or injure each other in their kingdoms. And so Filmer introduces Bellarmine and paradoxically uses really his own defense against him, where he posits that we are all equal to not be given to one man, but nonetheless we are structured around the very father that bestowed upon to us. Of course, every man has a father, of course. And so how could we be equal? How could we be this natural free condition if every man is bestowed upon a father that of course they did not choose themselves? And so for Filmer, this of course has ramifications beyond just a single household and the patriarchal rule within that household. These roles are simply sizable to different commonwealths, to different provinces, as we see when he discusses the 72 tongues and its interpretation. We see not different multitudes of civilizations or provinces, but really separate kin families with patriarchs from varying city-states and as such. And in many cases, when these patriarchs would meet up, they weren't considered the kingdoms to the size that Filmer is witnessing in his own time. And of course, this invokes the idea of honoring the mother and the father in accordance to the power in his own kingdom. And I think that's an interesting sentiment to really extend even to us in today's world, where, of course, if we follow, as Filmer does rather geniusly throughout this text, the logical conclusions to a lot of the ideas of a natural law is quite arbitrary. And so maybe nationalists and nativists who perhaps are listening could, see here where, there is no natural law insofar as, we are posited within a kingdom in our birth. And so to bestow upon loyalty, to have honor for the mother and the father in the microcosm would have ramifications in the macrocosm of honoring one's nation, of honoring one's people. And so he traces the growing kingdoms of this time to these different times, which of course you have the introduction of usury for Filmer, for or the likes of the democratic process. This of course scrambles really away the lineage that was divinely ascended down from Noah. And Filmer, the only people to really blame for this or hold accountable is of course the multitude that he discusses quite often. And so, you have this separation in the erect of different sects from this egalitarian idea that could be traced back to the idea of the creation of one as interpreted as an equal avenue. But of course, for Filmer, he believes that God instructed for the one to serve under the one, not to be mistaken for the one being a natural order that is quite arbitrary. And so, in other words, we are never free of the subjugation, just as the multitude to decree the choice of our own kings, for we do not have the freedom to be without prerequisites into our judgments. Of course, this plays into the very aspects of being in a household, being subjugated to a father, even in your own defiance, perhaps. If you look at things like family psychology, many times the parenting tactics that one takes on, goes against what they themselves were raised on, because of course they, have disagreements. Like, for example, maybe your father wasn't gentle enough with you, and so you go out of your way in your own ascent to fatherhood, where you want to have kindness in a more gentle way. But of course, your children, in part, could interpret that, oh, my father was way too soft. And so, these proclivities to how your nature was given to you by your father will have impact on how you will go about this. And so, essentially what I'm saying is, we're never free, really, from this subjugation. We're never naturally free from such a presupposition. And Filmer extends this by looking at the irrationality, really, of the idea of the multitude, picking their own monarchs, where, we're not free from, again, those presuppositions. We're not free from being elder. We're not free from potentially being lame. And to posit everyone in the kingdom to have a say in this matter, of course, is an absurdity. There will be people who have always been illy fit to decide, or that we have taken away the rights to decide, such as illegal citizens in a kingdom, or the modern city-state, if you will. At least that's what we're always told, at least. So there is always this restrictive capacity to the idea of choosing your own king. And in other words, Filmer's trying to say, logically, we can conclude that, despite the fact that we, can do this in a democratic process, we still cannot account for everyone. And even if we do account for everyone in a sort of magical way, we still will have these presuppositions to us, such as, being, who you really are. So we can never really have this full consent that we're trying to chase here in the democratic process. And if so, Filmer posits, which I think is very illuminating to the current world we live in, and kind of shows the timelessness of this text, really, at least in its critiques, is to consider, if we're all equal, then why shouldn't I be king? Why can't I have the authority over my state? Because, of course, there's no real differentiation between the credentials given from man to man. Of course, this is given from the divine down onto man. And so the rise of the Commonwealth and then the dislodging, if you will, of an unjust tyrant, or a shifting of government, Filmer, of course, points out rather aptly, historically, how much of a bloody process this is. And so who is this judge? Who understands the patriotic attitude of defying the sovereign, if you will, if they are not able to do a cost-benefit analysis, if you will? And this leads to perhaps many a petty arguments or a sort of self-righteousness towards the idea of overthrowing a state. In other words, a bringing about of anarchy. And for Filmer, of course, this is very unnatural of choosing who gets to govern over you, because, of course, you did not get to choose the father of your household. And then he, of course, uses Aristotle and his reverence for his rationality and reason, and translates how the equality, but nonetheless, Aristotle in the original form of government talks of many kins of what Filmer considers these different patriarchal family units. And Aristotle himself would define tyranny really as straying away from the first or the most divine force of justice, which of course Filmer thinks it's interesting that, Aristotle, he, tries to absolve himself away from giving his own opinions as he, lays out all of the different states and the types of them in, politics, and how he thinks of them and how they play out in ethically. Nonetheless, he thinks it's suspicious that Aristotle, of course, doesn't really talk about monarchy very much, and especially a just monarch, which is the sort of ideal, if you will. And for Filmer, this kind of encapsulates how, a just and most divinely inspired form of government would be the monarch, in Aristotle's own words. Very interesting way, actually says that God made all of mankind of one man, so that he might teach the world to be governed by a one, and not in the multitude, in the many, in that interpretation of, all being one, meaning all equal. And historically, that the father, if you look through the ancients, such as, when he really unpacks with Rome here, it was historically understood that, the father could put to death a son, and the magistrate, of course, would bear witness to a father putting down a son, but he was never to question the actual authority of that patriarch. The father's wishes is to be complied, and the magistrate was only there to really witness the event, so as it wasn't done in a sort of private way or in an act of pure anger. Going through with the processes of having the magistrate there kind of gave a cool and collective way of thinking, perhaps, that would be swayed otherwise if you were just acting in a sort of malicious way in the moment, in a sort of private setting. And then he introduces that the Roman laws of the 12 tables also contain many rights for the patriarch, and the enabling of parents to disperse with children, to sell them off even 2 or 3 times over. And so he really sees no difference here, even though, Rome is famous for its sort of plurality at many different junctions. He sees no difference really between the rule of Adam in that lineage and the economical and political power, other than the size of the patriarchal rule or the size of that commonwealth. There's no real distinction here other than simply the size of it. And so monarchy then is the most natural, for we see the one in the family above all. And so he continues really with examining the Romans here, where the example of the greatest multitude that we've ever seen in history was only durable for about 500 years, while there was many neighboring monarchs, such as in Assyria and the Eastern Empire, which lasted for 1,500 years or even more so. And so for Filmer, Rome, after losing its patriarch lineage, devolved to a sort of cyclical and cynical way of varying degrees of plurality of different governments, much like Aristotle, who again appeared in this sort of opinionless way of how he saw government and its drawbacks. Filmer saw, though, that within Aristotle, that the divine and the monarch was the most natural for him. Filmer even says that when we analyze about Rome, many people get this wrong, that there was tyrannical kings that need to have their power usurped for the purposes of preventing corruption, or being overran with tyranny. Whereas democracy, though, snuck in through the back door. Athens gradually shifted away from the king to these different roles dispensed, really, of that former patriarch, and it was done in a very subtle and gradual process towards a sort of coercive democracy. And so the people with a multitude, and its attitude is, of course, liberty without restraint, which is, of course, was very famous for the Romans. But nonetheless, you still see these echoes of the patriarchal rule still coming out, because, of course, this is the actual natural order for Filmer. He has an interesting idea of how, as corruption and violence arose, the strong and the wise, of course, are always, sort of posited with the nature of being strong and of being wise, is away from the multitude. So there is always a sort of lack in numbers, because, of course, there is the many in the multitude, mediocrity, if you will, as compared to the strong-willed, the wise, those who could actually be bestowed upon the grace of leadership and act in accordance to it. And so the natural of the people, in Filmer, one of the more interesting insights I think that he has in this text is to talk about the need for such a government to act with the public good, and this sort of ideas of enemies abroad, where the multitude always is looking for something to attack, really, something to dispense with. And there's no real peace or prosperity to be coming out of that, because the government, and think of all of the foreign interventions in contemporary times that we see today, where many times big moves in government, the solidification, if you will, of law and of sovereignty has come when there is an enemy afoot. Think of all of the Middle Eastern policies in the last 20 or 30 years, if you will, and the need for that sort of enemy to consolidate power. And it is not based in one of prosperity, such as with the monarch, he would say. And then we get into the discussion of the public good, which does not depend on the care of the people, unlike with the monarch, who has a sort of vestige interest in the common well-being of the defense of really his people. Filmer is very distinct here on understanding that the subject and the king, the monarch, the sovereign, if you will, has much less of a distinction we see with the ideas of these arbitrary public goods, if you will, because, of course, the monarch needs his people. And so each duty that's cast upon for the public good contains less and less of the vestige interest, and eventually will lead to carelessness, because, of course, there is no real ownership around the idea of the public good. And it's kind of interesting, and I've told this story before on this channel, but I think back to my grandfather, who was a foreman, a proud one, and the maintaining of his street. You could say, of course, that this is embedded with the ideas of the civic society that America once had, but nonetheless, I think there is something to be said about having authorship to having a vested interest in one's own community, where he taught me the idea of cleaning up your own street. Sure, we have this understanding now of well, the streets are to be maintained because of the state, who says it's to be a public good and has regulations and laws surrounding it. But it is the people themselves that actually maintain this. It is their own private interest, really, that actually gets things done, I think, far more than just this abstract idea of what the public good is to be. And then he gets into a very interesting historical discussion of many of the Roman emperors, and in his own time, the succession of Edward and Richard II. And these were, of course, people who were slain by the multitude, but nonetheless, historically, or at least as hindsight was given in that historical sense, these were considered good and virtuous leaders and kings. But nonetheless, the demand, the bloodthirst of the multitude in these cases, which of course leads to Henry's succession, and Filmer, of course, aptly points out that, again, who judges the idea of the Commonwealth being overthrown, and the ramifications really of it, because of course more English blood was spilt in these scenarios than anything anyone could have done to them abroad. But now we're going to the concluding chapter, which is regarding positive laws, its origins, how in order for the king to be of divine right, he must usurp the idea of law. And so we begin really with the king himself actually predating the law. For the word of the king was law, and for the king's interest in the people meant he must act for those privileges. He didn't just go about this in this sort of almost cartoonish way we consider the monarch now, in this sort of post-Lockean Second Treaty world, if you will, where his tyrannical interest overcomes him. The idea of privileges. These privileges were earned. They were given from good judgment and fighting wars and handling discrepancies amongst his multitude. Solomon, or Saul, lost his kingdom not from tyranny or cruelty of batting down the hatches, if you will, on his people, but by being too generous to his enemies. And there's a quote here of, "For the law is but the rule or instrument of the ruler." God's will with St. Paul and St. Peter is instructed by the king, and not by the king and the government, for one must be supreme. And as such, they advocated only for the monarch. Kings are only to heed or dispense with advice from the idea of a council, but is not bound by the positive laws that that council produces. And these laws, of course, have a sort of reward and punishment for those who are being ruled under them. But of course, the king in the supreme form, he is above reward and punishment. And so that distinction cannot be bound to a positive or natural law that's suspended out there in a sort of abstract way above his own personal interest or his business, if you will. So Filmer takes umbrage with the sort of classic Saxon idea of laws were meant to constrain the sovereign, the monarch, if you will, but this was to restrain the multitude and not of the tyrannical capacity of the kings. And as we see in Athens and then with Rome, we see the erect of the 12 table, which is not by authority of the multitude. They were never elected, of course. And Athens was displaced and given power to Draco and Solon. And so in both cases, you really see where you still have a sort of fatherly, the very tyrannical thing that we're trying to avoid with natural law, nonetheless still occurring, and perhaps even more pernicious because now we don't have any authorship of who is acting tyrannical. We just have this sort of governing body to blame on. So the nature of laws and the king, it binds the king to some degree, but not because of natural law or positive proclivities, but for practicality and setting a good example is what binds it by fatherly duty, much more than the idea of elections or being usurped in some sort of way. And as such, if a king is not above the law, how can he do away with an unjust law? If he himself conforms to the law, only the king who acts with mercy, with prudence, if you will, and is the arbiter of the upholding of justice, can give us law, for he must supremely be vested with the power to do away with evil. Law is, of course, the power to be able to act in this sort of moment, to actually have concrete rewards and punishments to be given to a subject, if you will, or a social behavior, a custom, as he would discuss. And so historically, he points out that customs, of course, didn't just arise as just customs one day, but they were sovereign law that was supremely given down to create a custom. And whether it was written down, of course, these were at one point unwritten in its originality, because of course the king predated law. And so the idea of judgment resorts to these very axiomatic principles to dispense justice, because of course in policy and politics itself, there is a diverse nature, such as with the law of reason. And so we have to find principles at some point, which of course were bestowed to us by the sovereign law of the monarch, not by a sort of abstract principle. And so he goes to Aristotle, which describes the idea of something being outside the bounds of a given rule or a law. There must be an interpretation introduced that dispenses with the justice, and it is in the sort of vogue, if you will, of that day's common reason or practice or custom, to given out as such an interpretation to be introduced. And so positive law is grounded in what is given in most cases, but of course cannot be engrossed in every application of time and experience. And this kind of made me think of the Deleuzian idea, and really Baudrillard as well, of systems being undermined by different applications of time and experience towards novelty. And as such, we have to consider that politics, of course, cannot be just bound in all places and in all times, but in some fashion, with Aquinas, if you will, where there has to be some sort of mover or sovereign who organizes out of his interpretations of these new novelties of cartographies, if you will, as Deleuze would talk about a lot, and their charting, really. And so Filmer then really concludes with going in this really deep historical look at a lot of parliamentary disputes in the Saxon tradition, and the following of the lineage of the king's grace, bestowing the natural law onto the subject, and not the multitudes themselves just simply being told they had this sort of freedom. This was passed down from the grace of the monarch. And so he has examples of the judgment of the kings onto the parliament, because of course there has to be at some point a decision that must be made, whether it is done in a sort of multitude capacity or not. There has to be at some point someone somewhere who actually moves these interpretations forward and passes them into law. And so he has many of these different instances where the king is who makes the laws of parliament and not the other way around. And with that, I think it obviously there's a lot of echoes here, but perhaps one of the most important is the idea of eventually this leading this natural rights, if you will, leading to the idea of anarchy. And with that, if you consider 400 plus years later, the idea of capillary powers that Foucault talks about, and then subsequently Baudrillard critiques with saying, if power is everywhere, then power is nowhere. Same with desire, really. And perhaps that could be pointed out to how Filmer really sees the idea of the multitude and its power capacity of bringing down the sovereign to them in a sort of equal footing. And as such, the king really gives up and just simply becomes a sort of empty vestigial crown, really an emptying of the sovereign, if you will. And with that, there can be no responsibility, no real firmly grasping of a sort of business that someone, an authority or a patriarch, would take responsibility for the well-being of the public good, as opposed to just simply the many, the multitude, sort of surveying itself to find this sort of public good, which of course is very arbitrary if it is to conclude with everyone having a say in it. But that's really what I wanted to discuss here with and Filmer's ideas of the Father being the one true, divinely inspired natural order. And I hope you guys have a great Father's Day in the U.S. and for the rest to enjoy around the world as well, and consider some of the ideas and criticism that I think still to this day, almost 500 years later, has very important ramifications for things like power and an understanding of democracy that we see today.